fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
We have Steve Luxenberg, and he's an author and journalist, and his book is called Separate, and it's the story of Plessy versus Ferguson, and it's America's journey from slavery to segregation. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Well, thanks very much, guys. I just want to chime in on the weather there. I think it's because you put all that money in Seattle into those rain barrels.
Yeah.
You know, that's what I understand you've got a ton of.
Oh, yeah. You know, it's constantly raining all year. But they're just not used to it when it gets a little bit colder and it stays on the ground for, a couple of days.
Well, where I live in Baltimore and in Washington where I work, we're no better. An inch of snow and there's panic. I grew up in Michigan, and we would look at an inch of snow and say, "What is everybody talking about?"
Yeah, yeah. And I'm from Canada, so of course I'd wear shorts in it. I don't know, but we're crazy. So, Steve, this is quite the book. Now, it's quite a subject, and it's quite important today, and it's very part of today's culture. Now, this case has been covered by other journalists and authors before. So, what's new about the case, do you think, now? Like, what made you go ahead with writing it today?
Well, if you ask anybody about the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is 1896, the Supreme Court 7-1 ruling that embraces the idea that separation of the races is okay. You'll either get a blank look when you ask them to go beyond that. They might say separate but equal, but not sure that even takes place. Or they might say, "Oh, I know that case. It's Dred Scott," if you don't tell them the name of Plessy. And so I wanted to understand the roots of racial separation in this country. I wanted to go back to the beginning. I was cursed, one of my early editors in the newspaper business said, because he said on a daily deadline, "Steve, your problem is you want to get to the bottom of everything, and you can't do that." But I wanted to get closer to understanding what this case was all about. And I tell the story as parallel narratives of the people who decided the case and who argued it and who lawyered it, and the people who were the resistors, who, of course, without their legal actions, their protests, their lawsuits, there is no case to decide. So that's how the book is structured. And it covers 70 years of American history in order to understand that racial separation roots that I was talking about.
So what's so important about that case? I mean, it's more than 100 years ago now. So why is that important to learning about things now, and why is it so pivotal in terms of race relations in this country?
Well, the case, as you probably know, separate but equal, it endorsed the idea of segregation, and it spread from the case. The case itself wasn't really recognized at the time as the landmark that we now understand it to be, because you needed to have that 50 years of reverberations. So we all know these indelible images of the 20th century, the Jim Crow era that you talk about, and we have separate waiting rooms and separate bathrooms and separate water fountains and separate schools. All that separation, it has come off of the 19th century. First, a custom of doing that in the North before the Civil War in some places in public accommodations. At the dawn of the railroad age, that's where separation is born, when a couple of railroad companies in Massachusetts decide that they want to run separate cars for their white and colored passengers, as they called them back then. Fast forward to the 20th century, and it isn't until 1954 that the Supreme Court reverses itself, which it rarely does, and says that that decision was wrong. They renounce Plessy, and they rule in the Brown versus Board of Education case that separate is inherently unequal. So here we have today arguments about, race is part of our national conversation. My way of talking about it is we're either talking about race or we're avoiding talking about race. And all of these issues that we've had throughout the 19th century, we grapple with them today in every issue that you can think of, in immigration, in social justice, in criminal justice, in law enforcement, in police confrontations. This feeling that people of color have that the authorities are coming down on them. And so I wanted to understand why people of color felt that way. I'm not a person of color. I wanted to understand how whites, how they feel about this, and I felt that to understand that I needed to go back to this case, because this is the case that gives us the separation that occurred throughout the first half of the 20th century.
Do you think in many ways that there's that this hasn't left us yet, that there's still this idea that there should be some sort of separation, and that would be a better thing? I mean, obviously there's some people that believe in that, but there's still a legacy going on, right?
Well, if there's a division, there are plenty of people of color who would be glad to do without white people as long as they had opportunity and equality. And there are plenty of white people who I think would be glad to do without people of color. But I think the heart of the country is that we embrace the idea of equality between the races, and we embrace the notion that I was giving a talk last night in Baltimore, and the former chief judge of the Maryland Court of Appeals, Robert Bell, who is a black man, was talking about his career, his legal cases that he had brought, and he made a distinction between desegregation, which is to stop the segregation, let's say, of schools. That's where we often apply that, and true integration. They're not the same, really, right? I mean, you can have one without having integration. And one of the things in the 19th century that the people who were bringing these lawsuits opposing separation, that it was always thrown in their face that what you people want, white people would say, is you want social equality. And we don't want to be able to mix with you and go to parties with you and have dinner. And the people of color and their white advocates, their white allies, would say, what are you talking about? We're not talking about social equality. We're talking about political equality. We're talking about civil rights. We're talking about being able to vote. We're talking about being able to serve on a jury, to give testimony, all of these rights that they had been denied beforehand. But it was a way of having the argument twisted to call it a quest for social equality.
But do you think that back in that time, that was what a lot of white people were concerned about, is that we don't want mixing of the races?
Oh, absolutely. And they said so quite forthrightly. They had no trouble talking about race in the 19th century, often in racist ways that we cringe at today, but they talked about it. And they frequently said, we don't want, white people would say, I don't want people of color mixing with us. I don't want them to marry us. There's all that underlying this. But people of color weren't seeking to have dinner with white people. They were seeking to have the same quality accommodations on railroad cars. They were seeking to have their voting rights without having to prove all of the things that white people did not have to prove, literacy and property and all those things. So it wasn't a fair argument to raise social equality. It was a red herring, really.
Yeah. So but wouldn't you say the political equality and the social equality? I mean, even if people are like, I don't really want to dine together. I mean, those two things are so linked that if you're saying, we have groups of people who, because of race, just aren't going to dine together, or can't use the same rail cars. I mean, they're never going to be politically equal.
Well, the railroad is an interesting piece of technology. We think of it as a past technology today. But in the 1830s, when they came into existence, there's nothing like a railroad car to throw a mass of humanity together and make them ride with each other, which meant that you might have a wealthy gentleman with his top hat sitting next to a smelly worker. regardless of race. And so this was a very, it was a chaotic and time with a lot of turmoil as this technology, the railroad, came into existence. Some railroad companies decided that they were not going to have a mixing of passengers in a car, and they ran these separate cars, but many did not. And the free North, the free and conflicted North, as I called it, before the Civil War, where there was not slavery, had this kind of, they didn't know how they felt about the mixing of the races. Whereas in the South, where you had slavery and enslaved people, you'd never put enslaved people in a group on a railroad car separate from their masters. You're asking for trouble if you do that. And the South lagged behind in their railroad building anyway. They didn't have many lines before the Civil War. The Civil War comes, and of course, there's a complete revolution, because the Constitution has, after the Civil War, abolishes slavery in the 13th Amendment. In the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law and citizenship rights for people of color. And then the 15th Amendment is voting rights. So that's a completely different Constitution than the one we started with.
So one thing I think about is that there are lots of opportunities in American history where we could have dealt with race much better than we did. And I would go back to the founding of the country, where they could have addressed this, but they don't, and they allow slavery to go on written into the Constitution. The Civil War, where they address it, and they get rid of slavery, but they essentially, once the North pulls out of the South, it seems like they allow slavery to come back just in another form, with the sharecropping. And then, this goes on, and then until the 1960s, you have a much bigger civil rights movement. But to me, I think the failure there was trying to get just political rights didn't solve the problem. Just being able to vote doesn't really change the community.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay.
I'm going to disagree with you. Because when we think of the civil rights movement, we think of the 1960s, as we should. It was an amazing time for that. But there was a civil rights movement in the 1860s. Congress passed 3 civil rights bills between 1866 and 1875. They addressed far more than political rights. The 1875 Act was a Public Accommodations Act. It mandated equality without regard for color, in theaters, in railroad cars, in steamboats, everything. And the lower courts began to question its constitutionality because they thought it went beyond what the 14th Amendment allowed. And then the Supreme Court declared it to be unconstitutional in 1883. If that Supreme Court in 1883 had declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to be constitutional, then your alternative universe that you were talking about, that would have been the difference. That's why Plessy wasn't surprised 13 years later, because the civil rights cases of 83 had outlined where the court was going. And it was limiting and narrowing the definition of the 14th Amendment and therefore of civil rights. So that's the moment. 1883 is a big part of the book, and it's because it has only one dissenter to the case. It's the same man who dissents in Plessy, John Marshall Harlan of Kentucky.
So one thing I think about when it comes to disparities between race is obviously, the legal system, but also economics, where there's a big differential in terms of income and occupation. In some ways, the separate but equal sort of certainly doesn't help that. But I don't really think the political rights help the economic situation that much. I think on the periphery they do. But I think having more integration on the economic front would have solved some of that problem and perhaps doing it sooner.
I think you put your finger on a key fact here. I mean, so economics means opportunity and access to jobs and education. You mentioned before the sharecropping, and you called it, slavery in another form. There was a good book called Slavery by Another Name that came out about 10, 12 years ago by Douglas Blackman. And he goes through how there was a kind of replacement of slavery with servitude. You would be a person of color, you'd be charged with a crime, you couldn't pay the fine, and then they'd put you to work, as capturing your labor in that way and not paying you a fair wage. That went on in the 1880s, 1890s, and into the pretty far into the 20th century in the South. That's what President Johnson is talking about in 1965. Is he trying to get the Civil Rights Act of 64 implemented and the Voting Rights Act of 65? He talks about coming to this starting line without the chains that you had in the past, but he said we have a long way to go because people of color don't have the education or wealth built up that allows them to compete equally with whites. So it's a starting line, but it's a starting line in which, like a staggered race around a track, you're actually starting at a point further back. And I think that's still happening. If you look at statistics today, which you just referenced, you see an enormous gap between people of color and people who are white on the economic front. So that's going to take a long time for that to become equal.
How do you think we solve that problem? And I know we're pushing probably beyond your book here, but do you think there's reparations for slavery? Do you think that affirmative action is enough on its own, that over time it will eventually correct the entirety of the problem, or do we have to have other interventions?
Well, that's a very difficult, very knotty problem, which I'm glad I'm not a politician. I don't have to be part of the solution. But I'll try to answer the question in a sense, which is to say that the reparations argument, that is the idea of paying the descendants of people who were in slavery, it's a political non-starter. It's just not going to happen. But I understand that argument now much better after doing this book. And I understand how not just because of slavery, but because of what happened after slavery for nearly 100 years, people of color were still kept from the starting line of opportunity. And so you have a situation in which, we have affirmative action. A lot of people who are white don't like it because they think it's unfair. No one gives me a break. But it's not you, white person living today, who is the problem. It's the entire system for generations that has caused this inequity. I think we just have to recognize it. We have to talk about it. We have to, the NFL, it's something I know nothing about, but when it adopts the Rooney Rule in order to give people of color a chance to compete for head coaching jobs, it's recognizing that hadn't happened before, and it needs to keep it in the forefront when we talk about head coaching jobs. Well, that's sports, and it may not seem very important, but it is important because it's a recognition that there's not equality and that we need to do something more than just say so. We need to actually act on it.
So I want to turn for a second and ask about some things that are perhaps more current, and then see how your work on Plessy versus Ferguson sort of feeds into that. So one of the big racial flare-ups that we've had lately was in Charlottesville, and I guess it sort of started with arguments about taking down Civil War-era statues. So this continues to be something that gets talked about on the news. They're going to take down, a statue of General Lee or something like that. How does this tie back into history?
Well, the Washington Post, where I work, I'm an associate editor there, did a fascinating article about these Confederate monuments and how they were part of a campaign, in part the lost cause, to keep the spirit of the Civil War alive, the Confederacy alive, but they were also, so when you see a statue to Lee, that may be different. That may be recognizing somebody who was a military genius, even if he was on the wrong side in the war. But these sort of statues that are placed around, I always think we need to know what was the origin of the statue itself and why was it placed there. So if you have a statue to Confederate veterans of the war placed by their family members to recognize that they died, whatever the cause, I think that's in a different category. But when you have people who had a political agenda of keeping the cause alive and they're using Lee as kind of their stalking horse, to make a pun about where he's often placed, which is on a horse, then I think you have a different issue. And you should have a debate about, well, that statue doesn't need to be there forever. Or if it needs to be there, maybe it needs to be there with a plaque and an explanation. Or maybe it needs to be moved to a different place. I think that's a perfectly legitimate conversation to have. Now, where does this come from, though? The Charlottesville, you started to lead into the idea of white supremacists calling themselves that, marching in Charlottesville in protest of moving these statutes or eliminating them. Well, white supremacy has been in the country from the beginning. That white people declared at the beginning that they were superior to black people. And then after the Civil War in the South, the conditions gave rise to white supremacist movements because they were excluded from voting. People who had been in the Confederacy in the high level positions or in the government, they couldn't vote. They were angry. They were seeing people of color getting their political rights, people of color elected to legislatures and to the Congress, and they wanted to seize back the reins of power, both politically and economically. That's where the Ku Klux Klan, not called the Klan so much then, just called the Ku Klux, came from. A Confederate officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was the originator of the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee and in North Carolina. So when I see something like this happening in Charlottesville, what I want to do as a historian and as a journalist is to say, well, do you know where this comes from? And that the fact that it's never really died, and the fact that violence is at the root of all of this. Between 1870 and 1950, there were, 5,000, 6,000 lynching in the country. This is where this comes from. And so, yes, we should be concerned about the rise again of white supremacy. It was a terrible, shameful legacy.
So getting back to the statue, so this, on the one hand, you're making a very good point that we ought to understand with each statue why it's there, and if it's there as a campaign to, clearly be white supremacist, or as a symbol of that, then it should probably be taken down or moved. But what about people who just get offended by these things, regardless of what the intent is? I mean, and I could certainly understand that. I mean, should that be reason on its own to get rid of some of these statues?
Well, that's a difficult question, of course. And I would say that when someone gets offended in something, I hope that I don't say anything that offends people. But if it happens in a debate, I'm always interested in why the person is feeling that way. I don't take offense at the fact that they're offended. I want to listen. So tell me more. What's your experience been? Where are you coming from? Why do you feel so strongly about this? And if I feel differently, as I did earlier when I said I disagree with you, I mean, we should be able to have disagreements. I wasn't disagreeing very strongly with you. We should be able to have these disagreements without having shouting and anger. But, remember, people of color, they were murdered. I mean, that's the fact. They're not the people living today, but the people, well, you could argue that they feel that way about some of the police confrontations. So you got to understand where people are coming from, I always feel. And as a journalist, this is part of my profession. I have to go get the story. I have to listen to people, really listen to them, really hear what they're saying. And that's why I think I don't have a problem with people being offended by something. I want to ask the next question, which is, well, why are you offended? Where does that come from?
When we go back to the Plessy case, now, do you think this is like the court's worst moment?
I think it is one of the worst moments. I'm not a court historian, so I wouldn't want to put it up on a pedestal and say it's the worst. But it's definitely one of the worst moments. And yet, it's also important to note, as I did before, that it's the third civil rights case of major import that they have covered between 1883 and 1896, and it's not a surprise. But it's one of the worst because they are essentially blind to the decision that they've written. Now, it's important to know just in one sentence, what the decision was about. They ruled that under the illegal concept of police powers, that's Louisiana's police powers to preserve law and order, a state responsibility, that the state of Louisiana could pass a separate car statute, that's car as in rail car, not motor car, to keep the races apart, as long as they were equal. That's what the statute said. Now, the dissenter in the case said that equality was a thin disguise that was just meant to cover up what they were trying to do, which is to keep people of color away from white people. But it did say that they should be equal accommodations. We now today regard equal accommodations as impossible if there is separation. So that's what the case was all about, and I think that the justices were blind to the fact of what was going to happen. But Justice Harlan, who was he was the Southerner who came from a slaveholding family, and he had undergone this remarkable evolution. He said, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have separation spread to other things than rail cars. And he said, one day we will regard this decision as shameful as Dred Scott, which was the case before the Civil War, in which Justice Taney said that black people could not be citizens whether free or enslaved. So Harlan recognized this in 1896. He said so. And he said that the races in this country are inextricably linked together, and our destinies are together. We must have equality. And he said, any law that plants race hate, he said this in his dissent, any law that plants race hate into the Constitution or any other place in state law is something that we should run away from.
I also see now you sort of mentioned that with this whole Northerners as well as Southerners wanted the separation.
Well, it started that way in the North in 1838 on the Eastern Railroad. When it opened for operation, it opened up with separate cars. Now, it was only one of 3 railroads that did that. The other 5 in the state did not. And it gave a great issue to the abolitionists, who were the political activists in Massachusetts of the era, because in addition to opposing slavery, they were now going to oppose the separate cars in Massachusetts. Now, why did they care? I mean, this is an interesting story. Abolitionists in that era were going to their night meetings on horseback. And it was often cold and dreary, and they didn't want to do that. And they loved the railroad trains. But, of course, there were white and black abolitionists. One of them was the famous, not yet famous, Frederick Douglass. And they were having confrontations with the conductors. And on the one hand, they were appalled. And on the other hand, they were thrilled, because it was a new issue for them that they could bring to the Massachusetts legislature and ask for the banning of these separate cars. Now, the legislature didn't want to get involved in the end, although it nearly did. But with pressure from the Massachusetts legislature, the 3 railroad lines I mentioned, they abandoned the separate cars in Massachusetts. But there were still separate cars in Pennsylvania. There was separation on steamboats all up and down the Great Lakes and in the Ohio River. So it was something that was accustomed throughout the country. Did all of the North want it? Well, no. All of the North didn't want anything, and all of the South didn't want everything. There was plenty of political debate, but the majority of people, the people who had the control of the legislatures, were white people, and they wanted it.
What do you find the biggest surprise in doing your research was?
Well, there were many surprises. I was surprised at how many resistance cases there were. I was surprised at the first use of Jim Crow as it applied to public transportation was in the Salem Gazette newspaper on October 12, 1838. And they used the term as if everybody was already using it as a common practice. That these 2 drunken white sailors, that's what the story was about, how they had damaged the railroad lines in retaliation for being ejected, that initially they were asked to go to the refuse car or the Jim Crow car. And I was really surprised when I saw this. Now, I knew that, that the North had endorsed separation in places, but I didn't have any idea that term was used. And I tried to figure out why, and my best educated researched guess is that the Jim Crow minstrel shows were so popular in the New England area at the time that they frequently showed up in newspaper articles in other ways. In other words, this is a Jim Crow moment, or that is a Jim Crow idea. And it was often used to describe politicians who, in our terminology, were flip-floppers, because they were jumping Jim Crow. They were jumping from one side of the issue to the other. So I guess it's not a surprise that they would apply it as an adjective to a railroad car. That was a big surprise to me. The other big surprise was the contradictory positions of the justices. So the justice who writes the Plessy decision, Henry Billings Brown, comes from New England, is mentored by people who are in the anti-slavery camp, and yet he ends up writing this terrible decision. John Marshall Harlan is from a slaveholding family. He ends up being the dissenter And now we remember Harlan, we don't remember Henry Billings Brown. So I wanted to understand the evolution of these two justices and the arcs of their lives to find out why they had ended up in the positions that they had. Because you would have expected, if you were just told their backgrounds, that they would have voted in the opposite way.
Why was New Orleans so important to the case and to your story?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I should have talked about it before, but we talked about it so much. So New Orleans is unlike any city in the country in the 19th century. I think you would say that it might be unlike any city in the country in the 21st century. But New Orleans is a place that is not like Atlanta or Savannah or Charleston, which is become a home to people who were liberated from slavery, and they are struggling to make it in the world, to get their rights. New Orleans, in contrast, has this sandwiched layer, is what I called it in the book, of free people of color who, before the Civil War, were sandwiched between people who were in slavery and the white people. And when the Americans took over New Orleans in 1803, the provisional governor came from Virginia, a guy named William Claiborne, and he was flabbergasted to find that not only were there 6,000 free people of color of various shades of the spectrum, because they were mixed race, but they had a militia, and they had weapons. And he actually wrote a letter to Madison, wrote many letters to Madison, who was Secretary of State, and to Thomas Jefferson, who was president, and said, "Hey guys, I got a problem down here. I got these free people of color, and they have expectations of getting their rights, and they have weapons, and like, what do you want me to do?" Well, his letter took a month to get to Washington. It took another month to get a reply, and the reply was essentially, "You're on your own, buddy. do the best you can." Because we're up here in Washington, and like, it takes forever to get a letter, so we can't do much for you. But Claiborne recognized that he had a political problem because they had status, but he also had a problem because he wasn't from there and he couldn't rule as a dictator. So he needed to tread carefully, which he did, and they maintained their status. And then throughout the century, there's critical moments. At the Battle of New Orleans in 1814, there are 2 regiments of free people of color who are fighting for the American side. Afterwards, they want some rights that they were promised by General Jackson. In 1863, when New Orleans is under federal occupation now, because it was so important to hold that port and the access to the Mississippi River that they put all of their forces into taking the city. And the free people of color recognize the opportunity, and they agitate. They have political meetings. They have petitions. They ask the provisional governor, another provisional governor, for their rights. And when they don't get any satisfaction, they send 2 guys off to Washington to plead their case with Lincoln. And Lincoln is very sympathetic, but he says, I got a war to win. This is a political problem. We'll deal with this after the war. And then he's assassinated. And actually his very last speech, 3 days before his assassination, from the balcony of the White House, he says, I think we should give some political rights to the mixed-race people of New Orleans. So it was a live issue. By 1890, the descendants of all of those people that we've been talking about, they are a wealthier, educated, mixed-race group. A lot of them speak French. A lot of them have French last names. And they are a very unhappy lot. And they decide that they're not going to allow this separate car act to go into existence without a fight. And so they arrange a test case. They announce it in the newspaper that they control, the New Orleans Crusader. And we're going to bring a test case, and we're going to try to get to the Supreme Court. And, like a lot of announcements, they screw around for a while and they don't do it. But it takes about a year for them to get organized, and then they do bring a test case. And they ask the lawyer that they have from the North, Albion Tourgée, the most famous white advocate for civil rights in America, he asked them to find them themselves a fair-skinned man who could pass for white, because he wants to argue that if you can't tell somebody's race without asking them, then how the heck are you going to separate them in the railroad cars? And so First, there's a predecessor to Homer Plessy, but Homer Plessy is, as I say in the book, is fair-skinned enough to cause confusion, and confusion is what they wanted to cause. They wanted to argue the law was unenforceable.
So that's sort of interesting to me, that would be the grounds on which they would challenge it, is the enforceability rather than the underlying idea that separate can't possibly be equal. So why would he have chosen that route at that time?
Well, Tourgée said in a letter to his co-counsel down in New Orleans that his experience, he had very little experience before the Supreme Court, but his experience told him that it was better to throw too many arguments at them than not enough. Now, I think this is not actually a very good strategy, but he didn't just throw that argument about it's unenforceable. He threw about a dozen arguments at them, to use the cliche, we're going to throw whatever sticks. Now, why would he do that? Well, last night I referred to this event, and I was in conversation with this judge, and he said exactly what I thought, because they wanted to win. And they were willing to win in almost any way possible. Now, that's not a very good strategy in the end, because sometimes you end up with bad law when you plead a bad argument. And they had a couple of bad arguments that if they had won, I think that would have created bad law in another way. But Tourgée has been criticized by constitutional scholars and legal historians for not arguing that separate could not be equal, for not arguing that the railroad cars were not identical, that they weren't maintained as well, that they weren't as comfortable, etc. And he didn't argue that because he didn't want to make that. He wanted to make the case on the grounds of the 13th and the 14th Amendment, and he wanted the court to embrace the notion that this was treating black people in an inferior way. And he wasn't worried so much about the quality of the cars, because he didn't want them to say, he was worried that they were going to say, well, we've inspected these cars, not the Supreme Court itself, but earlier in the case, and they look equal to us, end of case. They're equal. He didn't want that. And he didn't think the Supreme Court would buy the argument that separate is inherently unequal. I don't think he phrased it that way. That's the way we phrase it now, because the Supreme Court in '54 used it in Brown versus Board of Education. But as best as I could tell, I think he was nervous about that argument. One of the few that he was nervous about, actually.
So was that the reasoning for Brown? Was that was the crux of the case? Is that separate can't be equal? You have to integrate.
And also that their experience had told them that despite these protestations of equality, separate was never equal. It was always some difference. So in the case of Brown, which was a schools case, there was ample testimony brought by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that the schools were not equal, that the resources put into them were not equal, that the quality of the instruction wasn't equal, that the quality of the facilities weren't equal, and that the government was responsible for that. But see, here in Louisiana, we have the railroad being responsible for it. So it was a different ground on which they were arguing when they were talking about the schools. It's much easier to bring a case when the government is the party that's involved, because we accept that the government has the responsibility to provide equality. They hadn't yet really accepted that the railroad had responsibility.
Okay.
So what do you think the key reason is for us to go back to this case? Like, how is it going to help us out today?
Well, I just think that because race is such a part of our national conversation, that if this book can help people on any side of the question understand that there is this history, that I'm going to boil it down to a soundbite. Racial progress in this country has never come easily or swiftly. And if we understand that that's always been the case, maybe it gives people some better understanding about why we're still talking about it, why these issues still exist. We shouldn't be afraid of our past. We should understand it, and we should go on from there and not turn away from this discussion because we're, in the North in the 1890s, one of the things that I certainly learned was that they were kind of exhausted by the race question. They were tired of the South doing these things that they didn't think very much of, and they kind of washed their hands of it. Not the Supreme Court, that's not exactly how they decided it, but they were part of that discussion too, which is, you people down south, you keep doing these things, like, we're not going to do that in the North, but we're washing our hands of you. I'm being a little bit facetious here. But I think that being exhausted by the race question, I mean, can you imagine having conferences in the 1890s in which the title of the conference was What to Do About the Negro Question? Those were conferences that were held. How would you like to be a member of a group of people in which you're a problem that needs to be solved? I mean, that's just untenable, right? But today, there are many people of color who feel that white people still see them as a problem to be solved. Why can't we be done with this race issue? We're not done with it because there's not true equality.
So, do you think we will ever get there? Is true equality something that we can hit, or is there at best some sort of approximation?
Well, I wish I understood the answer to that question. I can only be an optimist, which is what I usually am, and say that I think we can get there by if we keep making progress. And I want to hope that we can get there. Are we going to get there? Our history tells us it's going to be neither swift nor easy.
Well, on that note, now, do you have a website that people can get a hold of you?
They absolutely can. They can go to steveluxenberg.com. That's Luxenberg with an N, like Nancy, Luxenberg. And there you will find my previous book as well, but also more information about my research into the separate book. And I do have a contact there, and I'd love to hear from people. I do answer my email, not always swiftly or easily, but I do answer it.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear from readers.
Okay.
And the book is available everywhere. It just came out this week. It's available everywhere, online, of course, but also in your local bookstore. And if you can't afford the book, please go to your library. I love libraries. Libraries are what authors, they give a space for authors' books to live on past the publication date.
Oh, for sure. Now, we're going to have your book posted on our website as well, so people listening from the website can just do one click and buy the book. And
That's great.
It's been a pleasure, and it's been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Steve Luxenberg.
Thank you very much for having me. Great questions.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.